Welcome back to the deep dive. We've got a massive stack of research on the table today, and honestly, it's a bit intimidating. We're tackling a figure who is so ubiquitous, so woven into the background noise of our lives, that he's almost become invisible as a human being.
It's a strange place for a composer to be.
It is. We're talking, of course, about Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky.
And you're right, it's a paradox, isn't it? You can't go through a Christmas season without hearing the Nutcracker. You just can't.
Or a fireworks display without the 1812 overture.
Exact. He's the soundtrack to Western culture in so many ways. But the music itself, it's so polished and grand that the man behind it gets lost.
That's the thing. I was looking through these biographies and the musicological analysis we have here, and the contrast is just jarring. On one hand, you have this incredibly popular, almost comforting music, and on the other, you have a life that is just chaotic.
That's the perfect word for it.
It's punctuated by these bouts of severe depression, a truly disastrous marriage, a secret life he had to hide, and this constant, gnawing struggle for identity.
That is the central tension of Tchaikovsky's entire existence. He's the global icon versus the tortured soul. And what's interesting about the sources we're looking at today is that they really try to strip away the great man mythology. They're not interested in the marble bust. They want the person.
Right, because the mission today isn't just to list his greatest hits. We want to understand the man who essentially built the bridge between Russian nationalism and Western musical technique. And I think to do that, we have to start by debunking the very first myth, the idea that he was born a musical genius.
Oh, absolutely not.
I'm looking at the early timeline here, and he is definitely not a Mozart or a Beethoven.
Not even close. If you look at Mozart, he's composing minuets at age 5. He's touring Europe. Tchaikovsky wasn't groomed for music at all. He was born in 1840 in Votkinsk, which is way out in the Vyatka Governorate.
It's a factory town, basically.
It's an industrial town. His father, Ilya Petrovich, was a mining engineer, a lieutenant colonel managing the local ironworks. He's a very practical, very middle-class, respectable background.
And the sources really emphasize the cultural context of Russia in the 1840s and 50s. This is so crucial because at that time, being a musician wasn't just a risky career choice. It was socially unacceptable for someone of his class, wasn't it?
Completely. I mean, unless you were a super wealthy aristocrat who could dabble in it as a parlor hobby, being a professional musician was looked down upon. In the rigid Russian social hierarchy, the table of ranks, musicians were essentially on the same rung as peasants or tradesmen.
It just wasn't considered a real job for the son of a government mining inspector.
So his parents do what any responsible parents would do. They send him off to Saint Petersburg to become a civil servant. And this brings us to the Imperial School of Jurisprudence.
He enters at age 10. I was reading about the atmosphere there. It sounds incredibly rigid, military-style discipline, uniforms, all of it.
It was a factory for bureaucrats. The goal was to produce the next generation of government functionaries. But the real story there isn't the curriculum. It's the separation. Imagine being 10 years old, shipped off to boarding school 1,300 kilometers away from your home and your mother, who he absolutely adored.
And the research is clear that this separation caused a lifelong trauma. He was prone to anxiety and neuroses that stayed with him forever. But that trauma, it pales in comparison to what happened 4 years later.
Yes. In 1854, when he's 14, his mother, Alexandra Andreevna, contracts cholera.
And she dies. This is the turning point, isn't it? The sources all point to this moment as the foundational trauma of his life.
He was absolutely devoted to her. The psychological impact was just devastating. There's a story that when his governess tried to comfort him after her death, he didn't even seem to react. He was completely numb.
I found a reference to a letter he wrote. He couldn't even bring himself to tell that same governess about the death until 2 years after it happened. He just wouldn't speak about it. That speaks to a profound level of repression and shock.
It shaped his entire emotional landscape. And very significantly, his first serious attempt at composition, a small waltz, was written in her memory. So right from the very beginning, you see this direct link. Intense personal suffering channeling itself into music.
But even then, he doesn't drop out of school to become a composer. He sticks with the plan. He graduates at 19 and becomes a titular counselor.
Right.
Which sounds very grand, but it was a low-level clerk position in the Ministry of Justice.
A titular counselor. It sounds impressive, but in the Russian table of ranks, it was quite low. It meant endless paperwork, copying documents by hand, sitting in a dusty office all day.
I just love the image of the man who would write Swan Lake, sitting there, bored out of his mind, filing legal briefs for 3 years.
It really shows that he came to music relatively late as a profession. He was dabbling, taking some lessons, but he didn't really start his formal education until the Russian Musical Society opened its classes. And this was the precursor to the St. Petersburg Conservatory.
And this is where the timing is just everything. He enrolls in the very first class of the conservatory in 1862. He's essentially a guinea pig for the professionalization of music in Russia.
Exactly. Before this, there was no professional music education in Russia. If you wanted to learn properly, you had to go to Germany or Italy. Tchaikovsky was part of the first generation to be trained in Russia, but, and this is the absolute key to everything that follows, he was trained using Western methods.
Which leads us directly into what the notes here call the musical battlefield. There was this massive cultural war happening in Russian music at the time. You have the conservatory on one side, and then you have this other group, the Five.
The mighty handful, as they were called. This is the Great Divide. On one side, you have the conservatory led by Anton Rubinstein. They are the Westernizers. They believe in structure, counterpoint, formal harmony, basically, the German way of doing things. They wanted Russian music to be taken seriously on the international stage by, following the established rules. Professionalism above all. And on the other side, you have the five Milli Balakirev, Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, Borodin, and Cui. And they were the nationalists.
And they were the rebels, the kind of punk rockers of their day.
In a way, yeah. They rejected the conservatory entirely. They were deeply suspicious of formal academic training. They believed it would kill the unique Russian soul of the music.
They championed amateurism, didn't they? I mean, most of them had day jobs. Rimsky-Korsakov was a naval officer. Borodin was a chemist.
Exactly. They believed that raw, untutored talent was more authentic. They wanted a style based purely on Russian folk music and the operas of Mikhail Glinka, who they saw as the father of Russian music.
So you have Tchaikovsky, who quits his respectable government job to become a full-time student at the hated conservatory. He's caught right in the crossfire. The Five must have looked at him with such suspicion.
Oh, they thought he was a sellout, tainted by the West. Balakirev, who was the leader of the Five and a bit of a tyrant, frankly, was very critical of Tchaikovsky initially. They heard his student work and thought it was too academic, too German. All head, no heart.
But then at the same time, you have the Europeans who hear Tchaikovsky and think, whoa, this is very exotic and Russian.
He was in a total no man's land. To the Germans, his music sounded wild, overly emotional, even barbaric at times. To the hardline Russians, it sounded stiff and academic. He was basically fighting a war on two fronts for his entire career.
But he managed to navigate it. The sources mention he was actually quite diplomatic. He didn't just ignore the Five.
No, he desperately wanted their approval, actually. He craved it. And he eventually got it, at least for a while. After some very harsh criticism from Balakirev on his first attempt, he rewrote the Romeo and Juliet fantasy overture.
And they loved it.
They absolutely loved it. It had the passion and the Russianness they wanted. And they embraced his second symphony, which is nicknamed the Little Russian, because it uses Ukrainian folk themes so prominently.
So he becomes the synthesis. He takes the raw, emotional, melodic material of the nationalists, but frames it with the technical polish and the structural integrity of the Westernizers.
That is his unique genius. He refused to be purely one or the other. He built the bridge. But while he was forging this new professional identity, his personal life was, well, it was beginning to unravel in a way that would define his legacy just as much as his music.
We have to talk about the personal relationships, or maybe more accurately, the disasters.
Yeah.
And we need to address his sexuality. Looking at the modern biographies, people like David Brown or Alexander Poznansky, there is a firm consensus that Tchaikovsky was gay.
There is no serious doubt among modern historians. The evidence in his letters, his diaries, particularly his correspondence with his brother Modest, who was also gay, is overwhelming.
But the way this fact is handled varies wildly depending on who you read and certainly where you are in the world. I was reading about how Soviet censors and even modern Russian officials have tried to erase this part of his identity.
Oh, completely. There was that comment a few years ago by Vladimir Medinsky, a former culture minister in Russia, basically denying it outright, calling it a Western myth. It's a battle over ownership of a national cultural icon.
They want the grand, powerful composer, not the complex, conflicted man.
Exactly. But if we stick to the source text and his own letters, the debate isn't was he gay, but rather how did he feel about it? And that's where the biographers diverge.
Right. On one side, you have what you might call the tormented theory, that he felt tainted, guilty, that he saw his sexuality as a curse or a sickness he had to fight.
That's the view often associated with the biographer David Brown. The idea that he lived in constant fear of exposure and moral condemnation, and that this fed into the so-called hysteria of his music.
But then you have a scholar like Alexander Poznansky who argues for a different view. He suggests Tchaikovsky actually accepted it as a natural, unchangeable part of his personality, and the real issue wasn't internal guilt, but external societal pressure.
And that pressure was immense. In 19th century Tsarist Russia, exposure could mean total social ruin, exile, or worse. The laws were incredibly strict. So this pressure to conform, to present a normal face to the world, leads us to the year 1877, the year of the marriage fiasco.
This story is just painful to even read about. He decides to get married. He marries Antonina Milyukova, who is a former student of his. He's 37. She's much younger. And he essentially does it to create a smokescreen, right?
It seems so. He wanted to stop the rumors that were swirling around him. He wanted a respectable facade. Antonina was, well, she was infatuated with him. She wrote him these passionate letters declaring her undying love. She basically threatened suicide if he rejected her.
And he, in a moment of panic, or perhaps misplaced pity, agrees. But he tells her up front, doesn't he? He essentially says, I cannot love you romantically, but I will be a dutiful friend and husband.
Which is just a recipe for absolute disaster. They were completely, utterly mismatched. Not just sexually, which was obviously a huge issue, but intellectually, temperamentally. He was a sensitive, highly cultured intellectual. She was not. He found her presence physically repulsive almost immediately.
The timeline is just shocking. They lived together as husband and wife for only 2.5 months.
And in that short time, Tchaikovsky nearly went insane. He suffered from acute writer's block, crippling depression, and there's the famous story, though some historians debate the details, that he waded into the freezing Moscow River in a sort of passive suicide attempt, hoping to catch pneumonia and die a natural death.
He flees to St. Petersburg, on the verge of a complete nervous breakdown. The marriage is over in practice, though they never officially divorced. She ended up in an asylum years later. It's a tragedy all around.
It is. But this crisis, this absolute rock bottom, it forced a realization. He had to face the truth about his nature. He realized he could never live that conventional life. The mask didn't fit, and trying to wear it almost killed him. And right at this lowest point, a savior appears.
The invisible patron, Nadezhda von Meck.
This is one of the most unique, most bizarre, and most fruitful relationships in the entire history of art. She was the widow of a railway tycoon, incredibly wealthy, and she adored Tchaikovsky's music.
She writes to him and offers him an annual allowance of 6,000 rubles.
A huge amount of money. To put it in perspective, that was several times his salary as a professor at the Moscow Conservatory. It allowed him to quit teaching and compose full-time. It gave him financial freedom for the first time in his life. But there was a condition.
They must never meet.
Never.
Why? I mean, they wrote over 1,000 letters to each other over 13 years. They shared their deepest thoughts on philosophy, art, religion, their personal struggles. He called her his best friend. Why the strict no-meeting rule?
It seems to have been a mutual desire to preserve an ideal, a fantasy. For Tchaikovsky, it was perfect. He didn't have to perform socially. He was shy and awkward. He didn't have to worry about her discovering his secret or being disappointed by his real-life personality.
He could be his most authentic self, but only on paper.
Precisely. And for her, she got to possess the ideal composer. If she met him, he becomes a flesh-and-blood man with flaws and quirks. By keeping him at a distance, he remains a pure vessel for her emotional projection onto his music. It was a soul connection, as they called it, uncorrupted by messy reality.
It worked beautifully for 13 years. He produced some of his greatest work during that period. The Fourth Symphony is even dedicated to her, until in 1890 she abruptly cut him off.
She claimed she was facing bankruptcy, which the sources suggest wasn't entirely true. The real reasons are murky. Perhaps pressure from her family, who were suspicious of the relationship. But the effect on Tchaikovsky was devastating. It wasn't just losing the money, it was the emotional abandonment. It felt like a profound betrayal, and it contributed significantly to the darkness and depression of his final years.
Okay, let's pivot from the life to the work, because the whole mission of this deep dive is to understand why his music hits us so hard, why it has such a visceral effect. We know the melodies are incredible. One critic, Harold Schoenberg, called it a supersensuous fund of melody.
He had an almost inexhaustible gift for tunes. But here's where we need to get a little technical to understand the Tchaikovsky effect.
Yeah.
Because there's a fundamental conflict between the nature of those beautiful Russian melodies and the structure of a Western symphony.
Okay, let's unpack this, because usually we think good melody equals a good symphony. But the sources are suggesting it's actually a problem for him.
It's a huge structural problem. Think of a classic German symphony, like a Beethoven symphony. It's based on something called sonata form. This form is all about organic growth. You take a small musical idea, a motif, and you develop it. You pull it apart, you twist it, you change the harmony, you let it evolve over time. It's a journey from A to B. It's dynamic.
It's like a seed growing into a tree.
That's the perfect analogy. Now look at a typical Russian folk melody, which was Tchaikovsky's primary source of inspiration. It's often self-contained. It's perfect and complete as it is. It's often repetitive. You sing it, then you sing it again, maybe a little louder, maybe with different instruments backing you up. But the melody itself doesn't want to change. It's static.
So Tchaikovsky has these gorgeous static melodies, these beautiful, perfect objects, but he's trying to force them into a German architectural form that demands change and growth.
It's like trying to build a moving, dynamic machine out of solid, immovable blocks of granite. They don't naturally fit into the development section of a symphony, which is supposed to be all about transformation.
So how did he solve it? Because when I listen to the Fourth or the Fifth Symphony, it definitely works. It's incredibly powerful.
He turned the weakness into a feature. He basically invented a new way of creating tension. Instead of smooth, organic transitions, he used violent contrasts.
Blocks of sound.
Yes, he juxtaposes different themes, different keys, different orchestral colors right up against each other. Instead of a smooth, logical flow, you get these tectonic shifts. He places completely dissimilar materials side by side with almost no transition.
So it creates a sense of accumulation rather than evolution. You're just piling on the emotional weight.
Precisely. It builds tension not through logical argument, but through sheer emotional contract and accumulation. The result feels unstable. It feels volatile. It feels like a psychological drama unfolding.
And that completely explains the hysteria criticism he always got.
Right. Critics at the time, especially the more conservative German ones, complained that the music felt hysterical or over-emotional because it didn't follow the polite, logical rules of organic development they were used to. It felt like mood swings set to music.
But that's exactly why it resonates psychologically today. It feels like real human emotion, which is rarely linear or logical. It's messy and contradictory.
Exactly. It creates a kind of dramatic tension that feels overwhelming and, for many people, deeply relatable. But speaking of critics, I was amazed looking through the sources at how much pure hate some of his most famous works received initially.
Oh, the Violin Concerto. Today, it's a cornerstone of the repertoire. If you're a concert violinist, you have to be able to play it. But back then...
Well, first, Leopoldauer, the great violinist he dedicated it to, refused to play it. He declared it was unplayable. And then you have Edward Hanslick, the most powerful and feared music critic in Vienna at the time.
I have his quote right here. It's just brutal. He wrote that Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto brings us to the gruesome idea that music can also stink to the ear.
Music, whose stink one can hear. It's an incredibly visceral insult. He's not just saying it's bad music, he's saying it's physically repulsive. It shows that Tchaikovsky's music wasn't considered pretty entertainment. It was confronting. It was too physical, too raw for the Viennese palate.
Even Tchaikovsky himself was a harsh critic of his own work. Let's go back to the 1812 Overture. We love it. Cannons, bells, triumphant victory. He hated it.
He despised it. He wrote it for a commission. It was for the consecration of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow. He told Nadezhda von Meck it would be very loud and noisy, and wrote, "I wrote it with no warmth of love, and therefore there will probably be no artistic merits in it." He thought it was garbage.
It's just so ironic that the piece he wrote for a paycheck with zero passion is the one that gets played every 4th of July in the United States.
It speaks to his craftsmanship. Even when he was phoning it in, he knew how to build excitement and manipulate an audience's emotions better than almost anyone. He was a master theatrical composer, even in his concert works.
There's another aspect of his style that the notes mention, which seems like the opposite of all this drama. It's called passéism, his obsession with the past.
This is crucial for understanding his lighter, more elegant side. Tchaikovsky worshipped Mozart. He saw the 18th century, the Rococo period, as a kind of golden age of purity, clarity, and elegance.
A pretty sharp contrast to his own messy, romantic reality.
The ultimate contrast. And he used this Mozartian style as a deliberate escape. You hear it so clearly in works like the variations on a Rococo theme for cello and orchestra, or in parts of his ballet scores, or in the opera The Queen of Spades. It creates this sense of timelessness, a beautiful, orderly refuge from the emotional storms of his symphonies.
It's like he had two channels, the turbulent psychological drama channel and the elegant, idealized past channel.
And he had switched between them effortlessly. It's another one of his contrasts.
Okay, we need to move to the final act. The end of Tchaikovsky's life is a mystery that rivals any true crime podcast. It centers around his final work, the Symphony No. 6, which his brother suggested he called the Pathétique.
He conducted the premiere in St. Petersburg in late October 1893. And the sources say the audience was just baffled by it. They didn't know what to make of it.
Because of the ending, right. Symphonies, especially in the 19th century, are supposed to end with a bang, a big, triumphant, major key finale.
And the Pathète does the exact opposite. After a massive, tragic climax in the third movement, the fourth and final movement is a devastating adagio lamentoso. A slow, agonizing fade into silence. It ends with a dying pulse on the double basses. It was a terrifyingly bleak and bold artistic statement for the time.
And 9 days later, he is dead. November 6, 1893. He was only 53.
The official cause of death then and now in Russia was cholera.
The story goes that he was at a restaurant with friends. He asked for a glass of water, was told they didn't have any boiled water available, which was standard practice during an epidemic, and he insisted, "Fine, give me the raw water." He drank it, and a day later he was sick.
Which, in the middle of a major cholera epidemic in St. Petersburg, is practically a death wish, especially since his own mother died of the exact same thing. It seems so recklessly careless for a man who was known to be something of a hypochondriac.
And that carelessness is what has fueled the conspiracy theories for over a century. Specifically, the court of honor theory. This was a huge story in academic circles in the 1980s.
This is the theory, put forward most famously by the musicologist Alexandra Orlova, that his death wasn't an accident. The story goes that a high-ranking aristocrat wrote a letter to the Tsar complaining about the homosexual attentions Tchaikovsky was paying to his nephew.
And the letter was given to a senior legal official who had been a classmate of Tchaikovsky's at the School of Jurisprudence.
Yes. And to avoid a massive public scandal that would tarnish the reputation of the school and all its alumni, this official supposedly convened a secret court of honor of their old classmates. They confronted Tchaikovsky with the accusation and ordered him to commit suicide to preserve their collective honor.
So, forced to take poison, arsenic perhaps, which can mimic the symptoms of cholera.
That's the claim. It turns his death from a tragic accident into a noble, tragic sacrifice. A martyr's death forced on him by a homophobic society.
So is there any real truth to it? What do our sources say?
The problem is, the evidence for the court of honor is very thin. It relies on third-hand accounts relayed decades after the fact. There are no documents, no letters. On the other hand, there are also inconsistencies with the official cholera story. Doctors gave conflicting reports. The body wasn't isolated as quickly as it should have been for a cholera victim. It's a mess.
So we are left with ambiguity.
We are. The consensus in the source material we have today from scholars like Poznansky is that there's no smoking gun for the suicide theory. It remains a compelling but unproven hypothesis, as the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians puts it. We do not know how Tchaikovsky died. We may never find out.
But whether it was a microbe or a poison, the Pathetic Symphony stands as this eerie, uncanny premonition. It's dedicated to his beloved nephew, Vladimir Bob Davidov. It sounds like a farewell.
It creates a narrative that is almost too perfect to be true. The great composer writes his own requiem, lays bare his soul one last time, and then exits the stage. It cements the legend of the tragic soul for all time.
Before we wrap up, I want to touch on one really rare, tangible piece of history that's mentioned in the stack, an actual voice recording.
The Edison wax cylinder. This is just fascinating. It's from 1890, 3 years before his death.
It's just amazing to think we can actually hear his voice. He's in Moscow, hanging out with Anton Rubinstein and some other musicians, and they're playing with this new gadget from America, Thomas Edison's phonograph.
The recording is incredibly scratchy. It's chaotic. There are multiple people talking and laughing. But you can hear Tchaikovsky's voice. A soprano is singing a little bit, and he critiques her trill, saying, "This trill could be better." A perfectionist, even in a casual party setting.
And he makes a little joke about the inventor. He says something like, "Bloch is a good fellow, but Edison is even better."
But importantly, he was wary of the whole thing. He apparently disliked the idea of being recorded. He asked, why should one eternalize it? He was famously self-conscious about his own voice and his piano playing. He resisted the idea of being frozen in time like that.
Which is just deeply ironic, considering he is now frozen in time as one of the immortals of classical music. So, looking at this whole picture, the civil servant, the closeted man, the master of melody, the structural innovator, what is the final takeaway?
I think the key phrase is that Tchaikovsky is the bridge. That's what the best analysis comes back to. He single-handedly bridged the gap between the early sort of amateur Russian nationalism of Glinka and the professional modernist explosion of Stravinsky and Shostakovich in the 20th century. Without him, the story of Russian music is completely different.
He made Russian music a global language.
He absolutely did. And critically, the perception of his music has shifted over the last few decades. For a long time, especially in the mid-20th century, serious critics often dismissed him as shallow or sentimental, precisely because he was so emotional. They thought if you wear your heart on your sleeve, you can't be truly profound.
But now...
Now we understand that his emotional frankness is his greatest strength. He wasn't afraid to be vulnerable, to be messy, to be hysterical in his music. One writer said he creates a psychological mirror for the listener.
That's a beautiful concept. When we listen to that famous swelling string section in Romeo and Juliet, we aren't just hearing notes. We're hearing our own longing, our own sadness, our own joy.
He sought to speak directly to the imaginative interior life of his audience. And he succeeded more than maybe any other composer. He validates the messy, contradictory, beautiful reality of being human.
He makes us feel less alone in the chaos. Well, I think that is the perfect place to leave it. A man of violent contrasts who gave us some of the most unified, emotionally honest art in history. Thanks for walking through this huge stack of sources with me.
It was a pleasure. A complicated man, but an essential one.
And to everyone listening, next time you hear that Nutcracker suite in a shopping mall or at a ballet, maybe take a second to remember the lonely titular counselor who fought like hell to write it. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll catch you on the next one.